All right, fantastic. Welcome to our next autism seminar series. We're really glad that you could join us this evening for this really interesting topic around evidence-informed decision-making about childhood supports, presented by Dr. Kandice Varcin and Marie Rodatz. Before we move forward, I just wanted to start with an acknowledgement of country. The Kids Research Institute Australia acknowledges the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as traditional custodians on the lands and waters of Australia. We specifically acknowledge the Noongar Whadjuk Whadjuk people and the land in which the Institute is located, and we're very grateful for the wisdom that they provide in improving the health and development of children through our research and clinical work. All right. So before we get started with our topic today, I'm just going to provide a brief introduction to CliniKids. So CliniKids is a unique model of integrated research and clinical practice at the Kids Research Institute Australia. We are a research team that is integrated with a clinical service. So our research and clinical team are co-located together. In this seminar, we want to draw on this model by integrating both the research and clinical perspectives in relation to key questions asked by caregivers and practitioners all across Australia. We have two speakers this evening. So we have Dr. Kandice Varcin, who'll be providing a research perspective, and we also have Marie Rodatz, who will provide a clinical perspective. Dr. Kandice Varcin is a senior research fellow within our team at CliniKids. However, she is part of our Queensland team, and so she was unable to be here in person for this seminar. So instead, Kandice has kindly recorded her segments of the presentation, and so we'll be sharing those with you. Marie, however, is here in person, and I will hand over to her now for her to introduce herself.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, my name is Marie. I'm the lead occupational therapist at CliniKids, and I've been an OT for over 20 years, and I've been very lucky to have worked most of those years with children with developmental differences and autism, and I'm very excited to be part of this seminar.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Marie. Let's begin by handing over to Kandice to take us through the seminar overview and address the first topic of this seminar.
So in this seminar, we'll address the following questions about therapies and supports, and we'll use those words interchangeably throughout. Is earlier better? Is more therapy better? What does better mean? And what support is best for my child and our family? In addressing these, alongside providing an answer, we want to speak to some of the complexity and nuance behind these answers from both a research and a clinical perspective. Okay, so question one, is earlier better? So why is this important to address? Well, from a caregiver perspective, the notion of an early window of opportunity, or the earlier the better when it comes to therapy and support, is widely touted. This can lead to pressure on children and families to commence therapy immediately, so they feel they've not missed a window of opportunity. By addressing this, we want to provide caregivers with an overview of what the current evidence actually says in regard to whether commencing therapy earlier is actually associated with better outcomes for children. From a clinical science perspective, there is a strong developmental neurobiological rationale for the assumption that earlier is better. And this is because of the way that human brain development proceeds, where the brain in the earliest years is more malleable in response to input from our experiences and the environment than it is in the later years. So there is then a hypothesis that supports in this early period may be more likely to have long-term benefits. The other rationale for the earlier the better is that developmental differences can be identified earlier than ever. So really commencing from late in the first year. And we can also more reliably diagnose autism earlier than ever, with some diagnoses occurring from 18 months to 2 years. So this has created heightened demand in research and in practice for earlier therapies and supports. But what does the evidence actually say? So there are some high quality studies using randomized controlled designs showing that some early therapies and supports are efficacious in supporting children's developmental outcomes. We also know from families and practitioners that early supports can significantly improve family well-being. Early therapies can reduce barriers to participation and support children's strengths and their emerging identity from the earliest years. However, when it comes to examining the link between age of commencing therapy and outcomes for autistic children, there is not consistent, high-quality evidence to indicate that commencing earlier or younger is more beneficial than high-quality support provided at other developmental stages. So the evidence is highly inconsistent, and some studies have found that earlier age is associated with more beneficial outcomes for children, while other studies have found no relationship between age and outcomes. While most of the evidence is correlational, one relatively recent study actually tried to manipulate the timing of when support commenced for autistic toddlers for the first time. When they did this, they found that for some domains, commencing support earlier was associated with greater developmental gains than commencing support 9 months later. However, this was only one study, and it was not a consistent finding across all developmental domains. So the extent to which the age at which a child commences therapy or supports determines their outcomes is still something that is yet to be rigorously researched using high quality research designs. So in other words, we know that early therapy can be beneficial and is associated with many positive outcomes for families. However, we do not have strong, unequivocal evidence that commencing earlier in this critical window of opportunity is actually more beneficial than accessing appropriate support at other points in a child's development. So what needs to be done? So if research intends to address this question in a rigorous way, there is a need for more rigorous, high-quality studies that can compare outcomes as a function of different ages. In the meantime, families and practitioners should be provided with clear and balanced information to reduce any unnecessary pressure, particularly as current evidence does not clearly indicate that earlier is better. Research should incorporate other measures that have higher importance to families and the autistic community to answer the question of is earlier better, rather than just relying on more research-centered, child-focused outcome variables. Now, this is something that we'll address shortly in this seminar. So it may be, for example, that earlier support is not necessarily linked to consistently better outcomes on developmental assessments. However, there may be associations with family well-being and quality of life. Okay, so the key takeaway in response to is earlier better, based on the research evidence, early support can be very beneficial. However, starting therapy earlier is not automatically linked to better outcomes for each child and family. I'm now going to hand over to Marie to speak to how clinically decisions are made around the timing of support for children and their families.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear Candice's summary of the evidence in response to this question. And I have to admit that I felt slightly disappointed when I heard that there aren't more rigorous studies to address whether earlier is better when it is such a, what I would consider, widely held view. But we know that starting supports early can have a positive impact on long-term outcomes. However, commencing support at any point that feels appropriate for your child and your family will have the potential for immense benefit. So, and also, as always, when we think about evidence-based practice, we know it's not just about what is written in the research papers. It's also so important to think about kind of like the experience that the therapist brings, and of course the experience that the family brings, and their perspectives are an essential part of evidence-based practice. So from my own clinical experience as an OT for over 20 years, and having had the privilege of spending most of those years with autistic children, I have observed that many children actually do have more developed skills in areas like language, cognition, communication, compared to those children I worked with 15 or 20 years ago. And while this depends on lots of different factors and reflects a range of factors, I've worked across different countries with different health systems, and of course the diagnostic criteria have changed since. So many children I see now may not have received a diagnosis in the past, and nowadays, a wider variety of children are being identified and diagnosed earlier, which provides such a great opportunity to also start supports earlier. I often also reflect on how fortunate we are in Australia, and particularly in Western Australia, to have such strong systems in place to support the children from very early on in their development. And while we'll need to wait to understand what the future of early supports might look like, in the coming years, something that will remain unchanged is that families have a right to access high quality support if and when they need it, irrespective of a diagnosis. And I think that part is really important. In other words, support should commence when there is a support need rather than purely as a result of a child's age or a child's diagnosis. So the question of when a child should start receiving support is complex and highly individual. It depends on so many factors, and I would never suggest that therapy should begin at the first sign of a difference. Absolutely not. We know that children all develop at their own pace. They're faster in some areas, maybe a little bit slower in other areas, and that is completely normal. And my message to parents is not to worry, but just to notice. Kind of like notice the subtle differences to work out whether support may be needed or whether these differences are simply part of what makes your child who they are. And it may be helpful to just write down what you notice and speak to someone you trust, which can be your partner, a friend, or it could be the GP, your child health nurse, or another professional, or maybe a child's educator or someone else who knows your child well. And as an OT, we focus on function, so not just whether a child can or cannot do something, but really how their strengths and differences affect their ability to participate in everyday life. And we also consider the functional impact of these differences, which often depends on the environment the child is in. So two children with similar profiles might experience very different challenges or successes depending on the setting, expectations, and available supports. So for example, a movement-seeking 2.5-year-old in a highly structured daycare with minimal outdoor space may find it harder to sit for story time, follow instructions by the educators, and participate in activities. But that same child growing up on a big property with older siblings and plenty of room to move may not present with many concerns at all. So on the other hand, a child who thrives on structure, routine, and repetition might find that same daycare environment very supportive and could feel overwhelmed in a busy household with less predictability. So I'm certainly not suggesting that families move house or change their lifestyle to suit their children's preferences. Absolutely not. But I just want to highlight how much the environment is important to really also identify when a child might need support, because it just depends on so many factors. So in short, if you have any concerns around your child's development, reach out, whether it is maybe an occupational therapist, a speech pathologist, a psychologist, a physiotherapist, your child health nurse. A clinician can help guide and support you to determine if support is needed and when support is needed.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marie. I love what you said about noticing early differences are just a sign to notice, not necessarily to worry.
Yes,
beautiful
absolutely.
to get your reflections. Thank you. All right, let's go to question 2, which Kandice will address.
Okay, now question 2, is more therapy better? Okay, so why is this important? Well, from a caregiver perspective, the notion of more therapy the better is something that is also often touted, and it does place immense pressure on families who are making decisions about how to best support their child. There can be a sense of uncertainty or guilt or even financial strain on this basis. So by addressing this, we want to provide caregivers with evidence-based information regarding what the current evidence actually says about whether more therapy is associated with better outcomes for children. And from a clinical science perspective, establishing what the evidence says about determining the best amount of therapy is important as it has implications for influencing guidelines and clinical practice recommendations. There's a high degree of variability internationally in what is currently recommended, with recommendations often in the range of 15 to 40 hours per week of therapy for young children. This obviously then has flow-on implications for service availability, wait lists, and funding. So what does the evidence say? So there have been some large reviews, meta-analyses and commentaries published on this topic within recent years. And the outcome of these is that current evidence does not consistently support an association between more therapy and better outcomes. When we look across individual studies, there are highly inconsistent and mixed results. So some researchers have suggested that when children's cognitive level is considered, and particularly when it is lower, the amount of therapy then does show an association with outcomes, with more therapy equating to better outcomes. However, this needs further study to better understand this association. It's also important to note that while research evidence does not consistently support an association between more therapy and better outcomes, this does not mean that the evidence says that less support equates to the same or better outcomes. The fact that there is no consistent effect tells us that decisions about the optimal amount of therapy for a child and their family should be individualized to each child and family. So what needs to be done? So we should, of course, be working in partnership with families to determine the most appropriate amount of support for them. And as part of this decision making, we should be considering other important factors over just outcomes when determining the optimal amount of therapy for autistic children. So this includes the child and their childhood. So we should be considering to what extent will a particular dosage of therapy impact that child's capacity to participate in other developmentally beneficial activities and in their family life. Indeed, to this point, our national guideline in Australia for supporting the learning, participation and well-being of autistic children and their families recommends that a key guiding principle in support provision should be to honour childhood. children should have the time and the capacity to be children. We should also be considering the views and perspectives of autistic people. So through qualitative research, some autistic adults have expressed that intensive therapies in childhood were harmful for them, while other autistic adults have also noted that being left with too little support in childhood was also harmful. So we should be taking an evidence-based practice approach to decisions around determining the optimal amount of therapy for a child and their family. And indeed, our national guideline for supporting autistic children has a recommendation speaking directly to this point. So this is recommendation 56 in the guideline, which states practitioners should work in partnership with the child and family to determine the delivery amount and duration that will likely lead to the most meaningful and sustained increase in the child's learning, participation, and well-being. And this recommendation is supported by good practice points for practitioners, highlighting that they should inform families that there is no set number of hours per week that leads to the best outcomes for all children, and that practitioners should be aware that the research evidence does not support the notion of more therapy equating to better outcomes. Okay, so the key takeaway from what I have just discussed, more therapy is not automatically associated with better outcomes. The best amount is the one that works for a particular child and their family. I'm now going to hand over to Marie to speak to how these decisions are made in practice with a family.
Thank you, Kandice. Yeah, it's such a great question and such an important topic to reflect on, and something that comes up all the time for us as clinicians. So it's a very common question, concern that gets raised. And I think, as we all know, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. It really depends on on every child's unique strengths and their support needs, and the family's capacity as well. The environment, the child's and the family's goals. So, and again, in cases where we do not have clear or consistent research to guide us, we need to think carefully about what other factors can help us to make those informed decisions. I completely agree with what Kandice said about the importance of working in partnership with families, like it is stated in the guidelines, and it's ensuring that we work together to explore what is the right level of support for your child, for your family. And at the same time, we really need to hold on to the value of honoring childhood. This aligns with our national clinical guidelines for supporting autistic children, which emphasizes the both evidence-based care and a strong focus on the child's well-being. But it also reflects the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, which is that it reminds us that every child has the right to be a child, just be a child. They have the right to play, to feel safe, the right to be happy, and the right to feel included. And I think that's really something that we all want for our children. And these rights are really important. Like, we all want our children to laugh, to experience joy, to feel connected to family, friends, country, culture, and community. So when we might see a child who seems unhappy or disconnected, we want to take a closer look at what could be going on. And some children might withdraw because they feel overwhelmed, exhausted, or tired, and they might need a break. And this could be a break from therapy, could be a break from social demands, or from the pressure of constantly trying to meet expectations. And other children might need something different. They might need therapy goals to be adjusted or supports to be changed. And in these cases, additional supports could help them re-engage and participate more fully. So again, it's looking uniquely at every child and every situation. And of course, it's also good to remember that therapy does not always mean removing a child from their day-to-day environment. We have many approaches now that work with the parents directly using parent coaching through telehealth. So programs like PACT, the Pediatric Autism Communication Therapy, or OPC, the Occupational Performance Coaching, which is often used by OTs. They're evidence-based and focus on building developmental skills through the caregiver involvement. They support the children's development while allowing the child to still stay in their usual routines with their friends and familiar settings, going to daycare, going to school, engaging with their friends as they should. And this is why working in partnerships with families is so important. We need to consider both the intensity and the approach. Should therapy be directly with the child? Should it use a coaching approach with parents? And where should therapy take place? Should it be at home, in school, in a clinic, or in the community? These are all decisions that depend on each child, the goals, and the family's preferences. And luckily, we have so many options to really try and find the best fit. And a key focus in early support is also strengthening the connection between caregivers and their child. Every child benefits from meaningful time with their trusted adults. Parents can support this by slowing down, being curious, following their child's interest, and using a range of ways to communicate whenever they have the time to be present for their child, play with their child. Because we know that all parents have lots of things to do, but it's really taking those moments to slow down. And this might include using spoken words, gestures, visuals, or other tools in those day-to-day moments. And parents do not need to spend every minute of the day in focused interaction with their child, but when they do engage, we encourage them to make it meaningful and enjoyable for both the parent and the child. So make sure that it's for both of you. And of course, consider the whole family well-being. Parents often focus so much on getting support for the child that they sometimes forget to take care of themselves. But parent well-being has a big impact on child outcomes. And the more supported the parent feels, the better positioned the parents are to also support the child. And as I'm reflecting on this question, I realize how difficult it is to give a specific answer about the ideal amount of therapy. And I would not feel confident or comfortable recommending a fixed number of hours per week for any child or any family. As Kandice said, we simply do not have the research to back that up. So again, instead, I suggest looking at the child's support needs and the family concerns. A family with an autistic child, they commonly engage with speech therapy, occupational therapy, psychology, sometimes physiotherapy, and then there are other support options as well, of course. And from a clinical perspective, we often see that families who try to engage in too many therapies at once, let's say more than 3 services like at the same time, they actually become overwhelmed. So this can lead to additional stress for the parents or even disengagement from therapy. So generally speaking, we recommend starting with one therapy first that addresses the family's main concern. So for example, if communication is your priority for your child, then you might want to start with speech therapy first. And if emotional regulation or behavior is also a concern, then work with your speech therapist to help you connect with a clinical psychologist, which might also be helpful in addition to speech therapy. And then therapy can come in different forms. So we have some sessions that are weekly, some that are fortnightly, and some therapy might be delivered in a group setting for several hours on the same day. And again, the optimal amount depends on your child, your goals, and really what works for your family.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marie. Question 2 is such a good question. We get it all the time in clinical practice, and it's nice to hear that the research perspective, the clinical perspective, but also it comes back to what's best for the individual.
Yes.
Yeah, lovely. All right, so next question, we're going to move on to question 3.
So when we are talking about better outcomes, especially in relation to the research evidence, what does this actually refer to? So question 3 is, what do we mean by better? So why is this important? Well, from a caregiver perspective, when researchers are referring to a therapy being evidence-based or having better outcomes than another approach, it's not always clear what outcomes this is referring to and what better actually means in practice or in everyday life. We know that families may prioritise outcomes like children's autonomy, inclusion, and their well-being. However, these domains are not commonly captured in research, and what is defined as better outcomes from a research perspective may not align with child and family priorities for seeking support in the first instance. From a clinical science perspective, historically and still typically, we're talking about research-oriented outcomes when we refer to better outcomes. These are often measures that are focused on the skills or abilities of the child and can include cognitive ability, language, motor skills, adaptive functioning, and even autism symptom severity. These domains are often included as outcomes because they can be measured using instruments that are validated, replicable, objective, and comparable across studies. So better in this sense is often defined as statistically significant differences within these child-focused domains. Now, while this approach aligns with scientific standards in the context of controlled trial designs, these outcomes are not always aligned with autistic community priorities and individual child and family priorities. Statistically significant changes in scores, while rigorous, doesn't always tell us how this translates to meaningful outcomes for the child and family in their everyday lives. And we need to be considering this in our research designs. So what does the evidence say? Within recent years, we have seen a lot more studies emerging on this topic that are focused on autistic community perspectives of what outcomes are important to autistic children, adults, and their families. So what does this research tell us about how we should be defining what we mean by better outcomes? In line with more neurodiversity affirming approaches, autistic researchers, advocates, practitioners, and community members have highlighted the importance of moving away from outcomes that are predominantly focused on the child and/or are referenced against neurotypical developmental standards, and moving towards outcomes that are more focused on the child environment fit. So in other words, outcomes should include measures of how much the people and environment around the child have adapted to the social, emotional, and physical needs of the child. There's also been a strong call and identified need for more outcomes and measures that are focused on the child's well-being and child and family quality of life. In our own 2020 umbrella review that synthesized outcomes that have been examined in the context of autism supports, we identified that there were almost no studies that had examined the effects of supports for autistic children on child or family quality of life. And we recommended this should be an urgent research priority.
Yeah.
So what needs to be done? We need to be embedding autistic viewpoints and the perspectives and priorities of children and their families when considering outcome measures in clinical trials. We need to develop and validate tools that can reliably measure constructs that are a priority for the autistic and autism communities, like well-being, quality of life, and environmental fit. Something that we concluded back in our own 2020 report, and I think is still as pertinent now, 5 years later, is this statement: grounding research in the lived experience of the autistic community provides the greatest opportunity for research to generate outcomes that are meaningful to and have a positive impact on the lives of children on the autism spectrum and their families. Okay, so the key takeaway from my research overview of what do we mean by better. Better often refers to statistical changes on research-oriented measures. This often does not align with priorities of families and the autistic community, and this has been identified as an urgent research priority. So I'll now hand over to Marie to speak to how meaningful outcomes are established.
Yes, so in practice, determining meaningful outcomes and therapy goals for families starts with the understanding that meaningful will look different for every child and every family. There's no one-size-fits-all approach or answer to this question. So it's all about aligning our goals with what will have the biggest positive impact on the child's day-to-day life and the family's priorities. So we need to look beyond therapy. We focus not only what a child can do in our sessions, but really on how those skills or supports transfer into the real world setting. This means asking, how will this goal make a difference at home, at school, and in the community? Will it increase the child's independence, their confidence, and enjoyment? But we also really want to look holistically. The child skills are just one part of the picture. We also really want to understand and think about the family routines and values, the child's friendships and the social networks, opportunities for community participation, the emotional well-being and mental health of the child and the family, their independence and safety. And we look at how the child's environment, so the people, the places, and the systems in place support or hinder this engagement. I second what Kandice said about the neurodiversity affirming approaches and asking about the environment fit, which leads me to asking questions such as, is the child happy at home, at school, and in the community? Because that's, of course, should be our utmost priority. But it's also thinking about the siblings, the parents, and the wider family network. Are they happy? Do they feel engaged? And are they able to participate? Does the child feel they belong, and does the child feel understood? Are their sensory needs understood, validated, and met? And do they have friends who just get them? And do they have friends who just allow the child to be themselves? So we really need to prioritize quality of life over certain skill mastery. Well, certain skills like writing neatly, catching a ball, using full sentences, of course, they may be relevant, but they're not the only markers of success. And often goals centered on participation, emotional well-being, and relationships are far more meaningful and sustainable in the long term. So again, it's up to clinicians to really partner with families. Families are the expert on the child, and we need to use open conversations and active listening to make sure that the goals reflect the child's and family's priorities. And sometimes this means shifting our focus away from what we might expect in a typical developmental pathway and towards what will make the child's everyday life more joyful, more accessible, and more fulfilling. So to summarize, what does better actually mean for this child and family? Is it more joy in the day? Is it feeling safe and understood? Is it having friendships where they can be themselves or being able to take part in the things they love? So once we define what better truly looks like for each individual child and their family, then we can shape goals that are genuinely meaningful for this family.
Amazing. Thanks, Marie. More joy sounds better. All right, now we're going to move on to question 4.
Okay, so now this all leads us into our final question. What support is best for my child and our family? Okay, so why is this important? Well, from a caregiver perspective, this is important to address because ultimately we're wanting to support families to access supports that are most likely to benefit them, their goals, and their support needs without having to go through a trial and error approach. From a clinical science perspective, there is benefit for practitioners to be supported in their evidence-based clinical decision-making around the selection of supports that may be most appropriate for a family. So what does the evidence say? Well, as you've heard me say throughout this seminar, our research evidence does not have a definitive answer for the optimal amount of therapy or the timing of therapy that is best for each individual child. And this is the same for the type of therapy. So what does all of this evidence tell us? It tells us that there is no blanket approach to supporting autistic children that's going to be equally beneficial for everyone. Instead, what we're able to conclude from this evidence base is that support should be individualized to the needs and preferences of each child and family. Now, while our research data is not yet able to inform us of what works best for whom, when, and how, we do still have evidence-informed frameworks to guide decision-making about what supports may be best for autistic children and their families. In Australia, we have our national guideline for supporting autistic children. This was developed with autistic researchers, practitioners, and advocates, as well as in consultation with practitioners, family members, and the broader autistic and autism communities. This provides us with a framework for what good support should look like. And some key aspects to this include supports that are child and family centered. So this means that support should consider individual child and family centered goals and preferences, and that these are respected, valued, and supported. Also, the child and family should be part of decision making. We also know that support should be individualized to the needs of the child and family and their circumstances. They should be strengths focused and neurodiversity affirming. They should be culturally safe, evidence-based, and they should be safe, effective, and desirable, and delivered by qualified and competent practitioners. Importantly, these principles in the guideline continue to strongly align with research from within the past few years, exploring autistic community perspectives of what support should look like. So what needs to be done? We should be investing in robust evidence-based models that can inform what supports are most likely to work for whom, for what, how, and when. And this is an area of research our own team are focusing on over the next 5 years. So we're invested in moving towards more personalised support pathways that are evidence-informed for autistic children and their families. This research can benefit children and families and their experience by better matching them to supports that are aligned with their particular needs and their priorities. It also benefits practitioners by supporting evidence-informed decision-making and benefits services and systems, as it's likely to lead to children being matched to supports that are better aligned to their support needs, so there is less trial and error. And of course, this research and practice should and will continue to be informed by priorities of the autistic and autism communities. So the key takeaway, our current research evidence cannot yet guide individual level decision making as to what support works best for whom, for what, how, and when. However, we do have best practice guidelines for how to navigate this decision making clinically, and this will be an active area of research over the coming years. So I will now pass over to Marie to speak to how in clinical practice decisions are made about which support may be most beneficial for a child and their family.
Thank you. Yes, how do we make those decisions? So again, like I think we've said it already, but like when we don't have clear evidence to guide us, the research articles, the research evidence isn't the only thing that makes it evidence-based practice. It also comes back to clinical experience and expertise, what we've learned from years of working with children and families, and the individual context and preferences, the child's strengths, their needs, their personality, and the family's priorities, their values, and their circumstance. So when there's no single research-backed pathway, we use the practice standards, like Kandice said, like the National Guidelines for Autism, and we also have the ECIA Best Practice and Early Childhood Intervention Guidelines that often guide clinicians in our decision-making. So, but just as importantly, we rely on the family's lived experience. They know their child best. And that's why we start with open, honest conversation with parents or caregivers about what's most important to them. And often these discussions work best without the child present, because we really want the time to just concentrate and have a valuable discussion about what's important to them. So often we can do parent-only meetings, and maybe a collaboration meeting, which could be with all the children's support people around them, like all therapists, the teacher, and the parents present, or it could just be the therapist and the parent one-on-one. And I think it's these parent-only meetings are really important to understand what the family is hoping to get out of therapy. What are their dreams? What are their goals for the child? It just gives you more time to really explore that further. So at CliniKids, we really value this collaboration and a shared conversation about what's going well for you, what could be better, and what would you like more of can be a really good starting point for changing pathways and just ensuring that therapy decisions are purposeful and aligned with what matters most to the family. But we also recognize that there's often more than just one way to reach the same outcome. So when there's no clear evidence that one approach is better than another, sometimes decisions may come down to practical factors, for example, therapist availability and differences in their training and experience. So sometimes it's just that a family can only make it available on Monday, which limits only certain practices or certain therapists' availability. It doesn't sound like this is how you should make the decision, how you should make a decision, but it's just sometimes just reality of life, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing either. So again, it's just kind of like checking what kind of like fits for you as a family. Does the parent feel heard and respected by the therapist? Is a child engaged, happy, and enjoying the therapy sessions? Do the therapist and the child connect well? And are the family's concerns being addressed? Are you really feeling heard by your therapist, and you know your concerns are a big focus of those sessions? And is progress being seen in the areas that matter to the family? If you can answer yes to most of those questions, then you're probably on the right track. If there is a couple of questions where you said like, oh no, I'm not so sure, then it's maybe time for a conversation with your therapist and just kind of like exploring some adjustment and just starting with an honest and open conversation about what you might like more of. Other key principles that we like to focus on is sometimes we need to slow down. So we know more therapy isn't necessarily better. So sometimes let's slow down. It's time for a pause. Let's revisit some of our foundational skills, and just allow a child to consolidate their learning can sometimes be more beneficial than just pushing ahead with a packed therapy schedule. So remembering that community connection is therapy time, playing at the park, attending school, spending time with friends, and joining community activities. All of these activities build skills, confidence, and a feeling of belonging. And these experiences are just as valuable as clinic-based sessions. So therapy needs change over time, and goals evolve as children grow, their circumstances shift, and new priorities emerge. So a therapy plan that's right for today may look different in 6 months' time. And overall, I just want to remind all of us again of the importance of family well-being. and how important this is. And a thriving family environment supports a thriving child. So this means making sure that the families have the resources, the time, and support networks that they need to reduce stress and promote connection with all family members. And above all, we aim to ensure that therapy supports a child's happiness, their self-confidence and independence, and a sense of belonging. So not just the development of isolated skills. The right therapy is the one that helps the child and family feel they're moving towards their version of a better life.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Marie. I actually find it quite encouraging to know there's not a recipe, but it's a really important consideration about it fitting around a family's realities, day-to-day life, family life changes.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so to pull this all together, question 1, is earlier better? Early therapy can be very beneficial. However, there is not consistent, high-quality evidence to indicate that it is more beneficial than high-quality support provided at later developmental stages. Question 2, we asked, is more therapy better? Current evidence does not consistently support an association between more therapy and better outcomes. However, Marie and I both discussed the need to consider factors beyond just better outcomes in determining the amount of therapy. We should be working in partnership with families to determine the optimal amount of support for them. Question 3, we asked, what does better mean? And often it is referring to statistically significant changes on research-based child-focused measures. Here we discussed how this does not always align with family priorities and priorities of the autistic community. We also raised the need for more well-being and quality of life outcome measures, and noted that in practice, this should be individualized to the goals and priorities of each child and family. And finally, question 4, what support is best for my child and our family? We spoke about that our current evidence cannot yet guide individual level decision making as to what support works best for whom, for what, how and when. However, this is an active area of research, and until then, we know that the support that is best for you and your child is the one that works best and feels right for your child and family. Typically, these are supports that are individualized, that are child and family centered, that are evidence-based, strengths-focused, safe and desirable. I will now hand back to Sarah and Marie for one final time to commence the question and answer section of the seminar.
Awesome. A big thanks to Kandice for recording those components for the seminar. Before we go to the Q&A section, I just wanted to say, if you're not joining us for the Q&A, thank you so much for joining us for the presentation portion. And I just wanted to say that we have the next seminar booked for November. And so we hope that you'll join us for that as well. Look out for your emails if you've signed up for our newsletter. Okay, so now we're going to shift across to our questions. All right. Let me just refresh. Okay, we've got a first question, and this would be a good one. It's for around practitioners, so it's a good one for you, Marie. So the question is, how do practitioners decide what to prioritize when my child has multiple support needs? Good question.
Yes, and I'd say that comes up pretty much most of the times because most children have more than just one support need, right? But I guess kind of like the main takeaway is really working in partnership with the family. So it's discussing that with the families and with the child if they are able to set their own goals as well, maybe, but if not, then with the parents, like what is most important to you? If you think about what you want to achieve in the next 6 to 12 months, what would be your ideal life? What would be your the one thing that you would like to achieve by that time? So yeah, generally it's going back to the parents and identifying with them what their priorities are. In some situations, there might be a clinician might guide you. I'm just thinking, like, as an example, if there is, if we're thinking about emotional dysregulation, but we also know the child is really sleep deprived and struggles to sleep most of the nights, then a clinician might actually say, like, look, we might actually have more better outcomes if we focus on sleep first before we set any emotional regulation goals, because the child is too dysregulated to even think about being regulated, right? Like they're just too tired. Yeah. So just trying to say, like, sometimes a clinician might guide you a little bit in terms of, again, their experience and what they've learned from working with other families. But most of the time, it should be up to a discussion with the parent and working in partnership with the parents about what's important to them.
Yeah, amazing. So having the family provide the focus, but then the clinician might be kind of providing some of that guidance around the edges of what might be really helpful.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, we've got another question here too. The question is, can I access a copy of the Supporting Autistic Children's Guideline? If so, where from? Yes, so you definitely can. It is freely and openly available on the Autism CRC website. It's available for download there, so that anybody can go and look at the main guideline, but also all of the documents that went into actually developing it as well. So there's a huge amount of transparency about who was involved, what was the process, and kind of what is the research evidence that it also draws upon as well.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
It's a great document and a great resource to be able to access that for free by anyone.
Yes. And families can access it, clinicians can access it, anyone in the community that has any contact with anybody in the community, but recommended for anybody who has any kind of interaction with autistic kids or their families.
Yes.
All right. I don't think we have any other questions at the moment. I can't see any more. So I'm just going to sign off and say thank you so much for joining us for this seminar. Again, if you would like to come along to the next one, we'd love to have you. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us and have a good night.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all. Bye.